Doings of Doyle is sponsored by Belanger Books, home of the best Sherlock Holmes anthologies featuring today's top Sherlockian authors. Belanger Books is the only authorised publisher of Solar Ponds mysteries, continuing the Sherlock Holmes legacy into the 21st century. Visit them today at belangerbooks.com. Welcome to Doings of Doyle, a podcast dedicated to the works of Sir Arthur Conan Doyle, the creator of Professor Challenger, Brigadier Gerard, and, of course, Sherlock Holmes. I'm Mark Jones.
And I'm Paul Chapman, and together we'll be exploring Doyle's eclectic bibliography to understand more about the great man's life and work. We'll be discussing his fiction and non-fiction, the well-known and the obscure.
And stopping by Baker Street along the way. You can find out more at doingsofdoyle.com or follow us at doingsofdoyle on Twitter. Hello and welcome to episode 37. Today we travel above the clouds in the company of hot-headed aeronaut Joyce-Armstrong in The Horror of the Heights. And here's Paul to set the scene.
Following the disappearance of the celebrated pioneer aeronaut, Mr. Joyce-Armstrong, an incomplete and blood-stained notebook is discovered in a field, together with a briar pipe and a badly damaged pair of binoculars. When examined, this document appears to be Joyce-Armstrong's journal, chronicling his high-flying experiments and his recent unsettling encounters in the reaches of the upper atmosphere, where, it transpires, a form of air jungle exists, as mysterious and dangerous as those to be found on terra firma.
The Horror of the Heights was written around autumn 1913, but might well have had its origins quite some time previously. Andrew Lycett, in his biography of Conan Doyle, suggests that the story was commissioned by the Strand 3 years earlier, and we don't know if Conan Doyle was commissioned to write any story for the Strand or if it was this story in particular, nor do we know why it took so long to be delivered to the publishers, although in November 1912 Conan Doyle complained to the bookman that he was suffering from what he described as a weary waiting for ideas. How true that is debatable, since in the 18 months before Horror of the Heights was published, Conan Doyle had been fairly prolific. He'd written both The Lost World and The Poison Belt, which introduced Professor Challenger to the world, and show an experimentation with speculative, if not science fiction, that's also reflected here in Horror of the Heights. And either side of Horror of the Heights first appearing in November 1913, we have the publication of How It Happened, a story which is based on a car accident that Conan Doyle was involved in, Borrowed Scenes, a pastiche of the work of George Borrow, and the Sherlock Holmes story, The Dying Detective. But as for sort of immediate inspirations for the story, we've got to remember that these were the very earliest days of flight, and Conan Doyle himself participated in both a balloon ride in 1901 and also in a hair-raising biplane flight in 1911. But a special inspiration for this may well be the groundbreaking flight of a French aeronaut, Roland Garros, on the 11th of December 1912, when he broke the altitude record at 18,500 feet, an incident which is actually directly referenced in this story. But aside from Garros, any quick survey of the newspapers of 1913 will show they're awash with aeronautical endeavours, incidents, and accidents. In fact, one of them in February 1913, which took place over the skies of Kent, involved a close shave for a certain Major Gerard, and one wonders if that name and incident leapt out at Conan Doyle. So manned flight was an inspiration, but it may also be that Conan Doyle was musing on exploration, and Antarctic exploration in particular. In spring 1913, Conan Doyle was visited by Trumbull White, the American editor of Everybody's magazine, which later that year published Horror of the Heights in the US. And for the best part of a decade, Trumbull White had been lobbying Conan Doyle and his brother-in-law, Willie Hornung, for a series of Holmes versus Raffles stories, which Conan Doyle had politely declined several times. But that wasn't the reason why White was in Britain. He was there because he was arranging for the publication of the diaries of the late Captain Robert Scott, who had frozen to death on the expedition to the Antarctic the previous year. And the highlight of that diary was to be Scott's tragic last message. And of course, here in Horror of the Heights, we also have an emphasis on a tragic last message. Horror of the Heights then first appeared in the Strand magazine in November 1913 with illustrations by W.R.S. Stott, 4 of them very beautiful and in full colour. And in the US, it had first appeared in Everybody's magazine with illustrations by Henry Reuterdahl, who also illustrated Conan Doyle's prophetic submarine tale, Danger, for Collier's magazine. And that's a story that also has some resonances with Horror of the Heights written around this time. And there's a wonderful facsimile of the manuscript with annotations by Phil Burgum, which was released by Calabash Press in 2004 and is well worth tracking down.
Yeah, as you've mentioned there, Mark, the early 20th century really is a time when kind of heavier than air flight is really taking off. Before that had been balloons and dirigibles of various kinds. And then once you've got the Wright brothers in 1903 flying their biplane, it then opens the world up to this sort of technology. And it seems to have been particularly active in France, where you've got a flight in November 1906 by a Brazilian who lived in France, Santos Dumont. You Henri Firmin piloting the Voisin biplane in 1907. Blériot, of course, with his Antoinette monoplane crossing the English Channel in July 1909. So all this is very inspirational stuff. And it's interesting that Lord Northcliffe, who the proprietor of the Daily Mail, was watching this with almost a jaundiced eye, seeing all these French triumphs. And he really wanted to see some British development moving with this. And he offered prize money to try and encourage British development. And one of his ideas was a circuit of Britain air race. But kind of before this, in 1910, there'd been another race between a British pilot, Claude Graham White, and a French pilot, Louis Paulin. And this was from London to Manchester. And unfortunately for all Northcliffe's hopes and so on, Paulin won. But in the following year, you saw the real first circuit race, which started on the coast of southeast England and was meant to go around the entire coast and end up back in southeast England. And this really attracted great public interest and press interest. And I'm sure Conan Doyle himself will have really spotted this. This would have kind of excited him, I'm quite sure, and thought, this is rather interesting stuff going on here. And there were numerous competitors. Most had to drop out because various breakdowns and crashes. And in the end, probably much to Northcliffe's disappointment, it was won by a French naval lieutenant, Jean-Louis Conneau, who actually flew under the name André Beaumont. He won the £10,000 prize that Northcliffe was offering. And the runner was another Frenchman, Jules Védrine, and both of them were flying French machines as well. So unfortunately, it sort of backfired in that sense. But again, you've got the development of aero technology and aero industry. So it is encouraging this at the same time.
And that took place about the same time as the Prince Henry Tour, which was another example of these kind of national sporting rivalries with a sort of technological bent. And we covered that in episode 4 on the story Danger.
And in August 1913, the year the Horror of Heights was published, another British circuit was attempted, this time by Harry Hawker, and it was a seaplane special. And he was flying a seaplane with floats, and he actually got from southeast England round the coast over the north of Scotland, but unfortunately crashed near Dublin. So never made the actual circuit.
Wow.
But all of this, I'm quite sure, because of the publicity, will have attracted Conan Doyle to his attention with this, and whether his mind was already thinking on doing an aircraft story. And again, as you mentioned earlier, on the 25th of May 1911, Conan Doyle himself had taken a flight in a biplane from Hendon.
Yes.
And he wrote of the experience in Memories and Adventures. I had one aeroplane excursion in rather early days, but the experience was not entirely a pleasant one. Machines were under-engined in those days and very much at the mercy of the wind. We went up at Hendon, but the machine was a heavy biplane, and though it went downwind like a swallow, It was more serious when we turned and found, looking down, that the objects below us were stationary or even inclined to drift backwards. However, we got back to the field at last, and I think the pilot was as relieved as I. What impressed me most was the terrible racket of the propeller, comparing so unfavourably with the delicious calm of the balloon journey, i.e. the one he'd taken in 1901. So, this sort of stuff was very much in his mind at this particular point in time.
I hadn't noticed before as well that reference to looking downwards. There's a moment in The Horror of the Heights where Joyce-Armstrong is looking down at the planes buzzing below. It feels very much like he's drawing on direct personal experience in that.
Oh, absolutely. I'm sure, and I'm sure this story wasn't written until after he'd taken that flight, because there's real verisimilitude
Mm,
in the writing, and it's also interesting that you've got that reference there to the racket.
yes.
And in the story, Joyce-Armstrong is flying a Paul, and these are fictional names which we'll come on to later.
Mm,
He's flying a Paul Verner monoplane with a 175 rubber engine, which
yeah.
has a full deep-throated purr, and then says, unlike the monstrous racket of the early machines.
Yeah. Yeah.
So again, that seems to be coming out of his experience,
Mm,
and it's notable, something that you've spotted on the reproduction manuscript as well, that he was originally going to be flying a Blériot monoplane. And then decided to change it to a Paul Verner for reasons that we'll go into later.
yeah. Yeah. I mean, there's another possible aeronaut influence on this who's got a connection to Conan Doyle, and that's Gertrude Bacon, who was a pioneer aeronaut, one of the first women to fly a balloon in 1898, and it was Alexis Barquin at the wonderful Conan Doyle Encyclopedia site who made this connection. And Gertrude Bacon wrote several books on the subject, including Record of an Aeronaut in 1907 and Memories of Land and Sky in 1928, which has a very peculiar direct connection to both the Strand and to Conan Doyle, in that in March 1899, she wrote an article for The Strand entitled Pigs of Celebrities, in which she asked famous people to draw pigs blindfolded. And Conan Doyle supplied a pretty dreadful attempt. And we've done our own attempt, which will appear in the show notes as well. But she, shortly after that article appeared, she and her father took a pretty hair-raising balloon flight in November 1899. And as Alexi says, several details of this anecdote from Gertrude Bacon: the fear of the dangers of altitude, the cap lost over the side, the distress messages thrown overboard and then found on the ground, the crash, are details that can be found in The Horror of the Heights. Another possible person to have influenced Conan Doyle, or at least been in the back of his mind as he's writing this story.
And in relation to that as well, you could compare their flight to Conan Doyle's own balloon flight, which he seems rather to have enjoyed.
Yeah.
Where you got his experience again in Memories of Adventures. He says, I had a balloon ascent in which we covered 25 miles and ascended 6,000 feet, which was so delightful an expedition that I've always been eager for another and a longer one. So the opposite experience to his flight in the biplane.
Yeah. And while we're on the topic of real world inspirations for the story, just want to go back to this point about the Antarctic explorer and to Scott, because I do think that this is a real clear influence on Conan Doyle on this story. I mean, when Trumbull White was in the UK, he was interviewed briefly in the Express newspaper, and he fixated quite heavily on Scott's last message, and he told the Express, "It struck me as the most remarkable thought that the very last passage, Captain Scott's appeal to his country on behalf of the dependents that he and his comrades left behind them, is written without erasure, interlineation, or correction of any kind." Scott's last message was, "Had we lived, I should have had a tale to tell of the hardihood, endurance, and courage of my companions, which would have stirred the heart of every Englishman. These rough notes and our dead bodies must tell the tale. But surely, surely, a great rich country like ours will see that those who are dependent on us are properly provided for." And Conan Doyle I think, has got the memory of Scott in this, not least because Joyce-Armstrong is a man who knows that death is round the corner. There is a sentence at the end. It is worth remarking that after his own complete disappearance, it was found that his private affairs were arranged with a precision which may show that he had a strong premonition of disaster. And that sort of put me in mind of another Conan Doyle character, Flight Commander Stangate in The Lift from 1922, who is a pilot who can sense misfortune and death round the corner. But Joyce-Armstrong has other things that connect him to other explorers in Conan Doyle fiction. There's, in particular, an emphasis here on the burden of scientific proof. Joyce-Armstrong mirroring the sort of things that you would expect Professor Challenger to be saying in The Lost World. In the penultimate section of the what is called the Joyce-Armstrong fragment, the surviving record, Joyce-Armstrong says, "And now it's my plan to go once again before I give my results to the world. My reason for this is that I must surely have something to show by way of proof before I lay such a tale before my fellow men. It is true that others will soon follow and will confirm what I have said, and yet I should wish to carry conviction from the first." And also, Conan Doyle did actually meet Scott and thought that this was the sort of man who would either reach the pole or die trying. And his comment to the newspapers was, "I little thought then that he would do both."
Yeah, I think this Scott connection is really fascinating,
Mm.
and particularly, as you said, that Conan Doyle met him.
Mm.
And you've got in the story, Joyce-Armstrong is presented as a very admirable character in that sense of pioneering and being this all-rounder,
Mm.
as you said, and someone to be looked up to. But he's also a pretty dislikable character
Yeah.
because he's so driven. And you get this from not directly from other characters, but from what other characters are saying about him.
Yes.
That he's difficult to work with. He's a bit of a kind of tetchy,
Mm.
um, difficult character, and very egocentric and very pushing, which of course these sort of characters have to be. And in reality, people who talked about Captain Scott,
Mm.
said he wasn't the easiest man to work with. He wasn't what you could describe as a lovable character.
Mm.
But he got on and tried to get the job done, and Joyce-Armstrong is very much in that sort of mould. He's
Yes.
the kind of the difficult man, but a hero.
Yeah, and that's another trait that you see in Challenger, I suppose, as well.
Yeah, he has his ideas, but those who see he's heading in the right direction will put up with that
Yes.
because they see the brilliance or whatever it is that's underlying all that.
Mm.
And there's also this other element in the whole Scott saga, which kind of links in with what I was discussing earlier with early aviation, where early aviation you have this almost Anglo-French rivalry going on,
Mm.
and then in the drive for the South Pole, it's this Anglo-Norwegian rivalry
Yeah.
with Amundsen and Scott, and that's one of Scott's other driving forces, personal driving force. I'm sure that it must be the Union Jack gets there first,
Yeah.
and this in this kind of tense world that we're talking about at that time, where the whole of Europe is an armed camp, and these international rivalries are just waiting to blow up in 1914.
Mm.
It's another strong driving factor.
Mm. Yes, so Joyce-Armstrong feels like a very real character, could well be drawing on this influence. And Conan Doyle does a very good job in this story of creating verisimilitude, isn't it? I mean, you really do get the sense that this is a real account. You have obviously real people thrown into the mix, real
Mm.
places thrown into the mix, and you get these sort of apparently real accounts of these unrelated incidents. This incident of Myrtle and Hay Connor, but you also get this kind of almost quite sterile, nerdish technical detail of Joyce-Armstrong's flight and the responses to the weather conditions and the changes in the note of the engine these things, it all adds. Again, he's drawing on his experience, but it all adds to the sort of reality of this. But actually, this isn't a present day setting. I mean, Phil Burgum does a great job in the annotated manuscript of pointing out that this story is set in the very near future, in the same way as was the case with Danger, the story we featured in episode 4, which was submarine technology just around the corner, but also similarly H.G. Wells, The Land Ironclads, which did the same for sort of armored tanks. But there's lots of minor details in the story that suggest that this is the near future setting. So at one point we're told aeroplaning has been with us now for more than 20 years. Well, it was only 10 years at the time. There's a reference to the engine being about 300 horsepower, which was, wouldn't happen for another 4 or 5 years. But probably the most significant one is some of us can remember how in our youth Garrow made a worldwide reputation by attaining 19,000 feet. Well, that was the achievement of December 1912, less than a year before the story was written. So you get these things that are feels that this is just set just around the corner, and of course in that Conan Doyle is making predictions, as he did with Danger, about what was going to happen, and some of the things he does quite well. He's able to predict that people are going to need oxygen when reaching great altitudes. I mean, he wasn't exactly guessing so much there, because we knew back in the 1860s that this was a requirement. There's actually a reference in the story to the Glacier Coxwell balloon flight from September 1862, where Coxwell, who was the foremost British balloonist of the day, and Glacier, who was a scientist who was going to do upper atmosphere experiments, got into trouble when they ascended to about 30,000 feet. And Glacier lost consciousness, and Coxwell became numb in the hands. And then to make the ascent, they had to try and release the vent. But unfortunately, that had failed. So you get the remarkable sight of Coxwell climbing up the rigging to then release the vent with his teeth and return to the basket shortly before he himself succumbed from lack of oxygen. So, it was well known. Conan Doyle knew this. It was referenced in the story as well. But some other things he sort of predicts and doesn't quite get right. He knows that, it's going to be colder there, but he predicts it being a lot warmer than it actually is. There's an interesting thing there about magnetism as well. He has this view that the higher up you get, the compass is not going to work anymore. Although, interestingly, we now believe that some creatures navigate on sort of inbuilt magnetic receptors, which might suggest how some of the creatures that Joyce-Armstrong encounters navigate around the world. But also, finally, you have these things like the meteorites appearing and bombarding poor Joyce-Armstrong. He's making the first of his 2 trips in this story, and fortunately for air flyers everywhere, we don't get regularly bombarded by meteorites in the upper atmosphere. But it's just great because it does feel like a real account, which is obviously setting up the second half of the story.
Yeah, and it's this whole idea, this almost clever double play with the reader here of, yes, this is fiction, but I'm going to make it realistic. And obviously, as you've pointed out, this is around the same time as he's working on, or he's just published The Lost World, which is pulling the same trick.
Exactly, yeah.
Which is where you've got the character in it saying he must bring proofs back. And then you've got the writer of the story saying, I must make this as realistic as possible, or as much as I know, as kind of the science, even if it ain't all right, it's got to sound right, and it's got to convince. So I think, given the knowledge of the time, Conan Doyle just about pulls that off with this story.
Yeah, he does. He does. And in addition to this near future setting, you've got other elements of this story that are science fictional and are clearly drawing on science fiction traditions.
Yeah, and along these lines, we come back to an old friend of the podcast, Jules Verne, who has shown up in a number of previous episodes because he was so influential
Hugely.
on Conan Doyle, who first read him as a schoolboy at Stonyhurst
Mm,
and read him in French and loved his stories. So again, you've got elements of his work beginning to come in. What's interesting, actually, you've got Verne was obviously fascinated by flight,
mm.
and his earlier stuff is I think it was his first book was 5 Weeks in a Balloon
Yes. Yeah.
in 1863. Which is almost 30 years before Verne himself actually took a balloon flight.
Yes.
So he's really using his imagination. And you got 1875, The Mysterious Island
Mm.
has a group landing on as the title suggests, a strange island that they've got there in a balloon. But you've also got Verne playing around with the idea of heavier than air machines.
Yes.
And in those, you've got one particular character in two of them. The Clipper of the Clouds from 1886, which was the English translation of a book originally entitled Robert le Conquérant,
Yeah.
about this rather megalomaniacal genius,
Mm.
Robert. This kind of almost crazy inventor type, who would
Yes.
become so popular in fiction, as a character type.
Mm.
But he reappears in another novel, Master of the World, in 1904,
Mm.
where he like Nemo, he becomes a threat to the world because he has this machine that can it's amphibious, but it can also fly
Mm.
and go at huge speeds, and governments can't catch up with him. So he's this sort of character who would did develop like the Moriarty character into supervillains, and he's kind of taking these criminal characters and just taking them that one step further. But that these have definitely influenced Doyle with Horror of the Heights from the names. As I mentioned earlier, Joyce-Armstrong is flying a Paul Veroner monoplane. And if you look at that surname, you've actually got the name Verne hiding in plain view.
Yes, indeed.
And the plane is powered by a 175 Robert engine.
Mm.
So the Verne references are quite clear.
Mm.
But where Doyle is advancing from Verne is that Verne is really using his imagination
Yeah.
to create these kind of almost crazy steam-driven type machines, whereas Doyle is extrapolating upon existing technologies.
Yes, yeah, he even has that line in there, doesn't he? The engine is a 10-cylinder rotary rover
Mm.
working up to 175. It has all the modern improvements: enclosed fuselage, high curved landing skids, brakes, gyroscopic steadiers, and 3 speeds, worked by an alteration of the angle of the planes
Mm.
upon the Venetian blind principle.
Yes.
Actually, listening to your description of Rober the Conqueror as well puts me in mind of certain um, supranational billionaires and their
Mm.
pet aviation projects, which
Yes, fiction becoming fact far too quickly.
indeed so.
And the other great kind of science fiction pioneer, speculative writer who's always lumped in with Verne is of course H.G. Wells,
Mm,
and he also was unsurprisingly interested in the idea of manned flight, and he did a story called The Argonauts of the Air.
mm,
Published in 1895, which is about again one of these billionaire
yes.
inventors who has more money than sense in the end, and builds this massive aircraft, together with an engineer, and in the maiden flight.
Mm,
Things go rather
yes.
horribly and spectacularly and catastrophically wrong. But that's again that darker side of Wells
Yeah.
coming out very clearly in that. I mean, his other really notable air warfare type story is The War in the Air, published in 1908, which
Mm,
is a novel which prophesies the Zeppelin terrors of the First World War.
Yeah.
and the use that can be made of aircraft by the military. So he sees this coming, and the reality happens in a way in the First World War, but on a minor scale compared to the carpet bombing, which would
Mm,
eventually
mm,
come in the 1930s and 1940s in the Spanish
mm,
Civil War and the Second World War.
mm.
But Wells is very clearly sees the use that's going to be made
Yeah.
of,
Yeah.
of these vehicles.
Yeah. And Conan Doyle himself had experimented a bit with fiction around the idea of flight before Horror of the Heights as well. He himself had created a story which very much owes itself to Verne's Robo, which is the Great Brown Paracord Motor, which first appeared in March 1892. The story was actually completed a lot earlier. It was written completed in January 1889, but it's one of those paper boomerangs that Conan Doyle talks about that flew around the various publishers until it found a home. And it's the story of two men and their partnership. Pericord is a kind of theorist, idealist character, the inventor and the brains behind this new flying machine. And Brown is who's called a mechanician, or is a sort of mechanic, basically, who is able to turn that machine, that idea, into an actual engine. And the story focuses on the fact that Brown essentially patents the invention without Pericord knowing, and the two come to blows when they're testing the machine on the Sussex Down, and Brown accidentally stabs himself in the altercation, and it ends with Pericord being so disgusted with the machine and what has occurred that he straps Brown's body to the motor and sends it out to sea, so that his business partner and his invention are sort of lost in the waves. And it's an interesting story because it's again experimenting with this idea of heavier than air flight. It's a peculiar motor that is essentially like an enormous fan, but with wings as well. And the other thing about it is that, in Brown Pericord, you have these two characters, one of whom is a mechanic, one of whom is an inventor. And as I just mentioned earlier in that quote, that description of Joyce-Armstrong, he is described very explicitly as a mechanic and inventor. It's like Conan Doyle has combined these two into this particular character.
It's particularly interesting when you put it in conjunction with the Argonauts of the Air by Wells, where both stories involve a kind of dreamy inventor type who have to have engineer sidekicks
Yes.
to bring this thing into reality. But what's particularly striking is it's Wells is the writer who people really associate with this sort of fiction.
Mm.
And here was Conan Doyle working on an idea 3 years before Wells's story appeared. So again, Doyle sometimes gets overlooked
Yeah.
for this kind of work. So it's always Vernon Wells.
Yeah.
But another story kind of connected to this is one that appeared in Pearson's magazine in 1901. And I was just reminded when you talk there about Brown's body being strapped to this flying engine and drifting off across the ocean. And this earlier story, the Pearson story, was called The Fate of the Firefly, and it's by the Reverend J.M. Bacon, who is none other than the father of Gertrude Bacon, who you mentioned earlier.
Yes.
And so he also was interested in pioneer aviation and aeronautica, and he obviously passed this on to Gertrude. And in the story, The Fate of the Firefly, you have this strange flying machine has been invented by a reclusive genius in Yorkshire. And the narrator comes along with his niece and ward, Mabel, and they're looking at this machine, and Mabel decides to have her lunch sat in it, and the inventor's St. Bernard dog jumps in and sets the machine off, and there she goes flying away across the North Sea. And the inventor and the uncle have to chase her halfway across Europe. She ends up crashing very safely in Norway. Um, but it's again it's a far more slight story than the Wells or the Conan Doyle stories. But again, interesting show. These ideas were definitely in the air, so to speak. And again, coming back to Gertrude, the character of Mabel, say the narrator's niece and ward, I feel is a representative character for Gertrude herself.
Yeah, sounds like it.
Mm.
So we talked about this being a science fiction story in part, but it's also a horror story. Again, there's a connection back to Wells. I mean, Wells wrote The Sea Raiders in the literary supplement about a giant squid that attacks people on the Devon coast. I've always wondered if that's an influence on The Lion's Mane, because it starts with a retired merchant walking across the cliffs looking down to see a body on the shore, except Wells' story is rather more about fighting a giant squid than it is about working out what was going on. But in the same kind of way, this is a creature feature, isn't it? This is Conan Doyle creates these incredible beings high up in the clouds, and as with most of sort of Conan Doyle's monster creations, they either tend to be prehistoric creatures that have been restored, like the dinosaurs in the Lost World, or indeed this sort of prehistoric bear creature in the Terror of Blue John Gap, or they're just creatures that are enormous in size, a bit like the undersea creatures in the Maricot Deep again. And again, that's another sort of Vernian influence. The jellyfish are just a fantastic part of this story. He has this wonderful way of easing you into the story with the sort of beauty of the jellyfish before he gets onto the real villains of the piece. He says, some hundreds of them drifted past me, a wonderful fairy squadron of strange, unknown argosies of the sky, creatures whose form and substance were so attuned to these pure heights that one could not conceive anything so delicate within actual sight or sound of earth. But then you obviously get onto this next set of creatures, which are described as air snakes. And of the air snakes, he says, the whole aspect of this monster was formidable and threatening, and it kept changing its colour from a very light mauve to a dark angry purple, so thick that it cast a shadow as it drifted between my monoplane and the sun. I knew that it meant mischief. Every purple flush of its hideous body told me so. And the symbolism of it being purple is something that comes up in other stories of the time. You have Fred White's The Purple Terror in the Strand in September 1899. There's another story, M.P. Shields' The Purple Cloud, which is a kind of Last Man on Earth story when the world is consumed by a deadly poisonous cloud, and it's clearly an influence on the poison belt. And then there's another story there, the Purple Death by W.L. Alden, which came out in Castles in 1895. And Andrew Glazard pointed out that Sir Nigel, Conan Doyle's great chivalric epic from 1906, begins with the Black Death and describes the Black Death appearing as a purple cloud. So Conan Doyle clearly tapping into something there. But there's also something quite Lovecraftian about this story, or proto-Lovecraftian, I suppose you'd say now. There's a line right at the beginning which immediately put me in the mind of the works of H.P. Lovecraft, where we're told that humanity is just adjusting to the contents of the Joyce-Armstrong fragment. This world of ours appears to be separated by a slight and precarious margin of safety from a most singular and unexpected danger.
Yes, as I said with the with the Wells story, the Argonauts of the Air, Conan Doyle is ahead of the curve in many ways in this, and yes, as you've just pointed out with this idea of the unknown and if only humanity knew. Yeah, this very much ties in with a lot of Lovecraft's ideas of almost, if we all knew what such and such knew, we would do as he did and blow our brains out, kind of thing, in fear. It's that sort of feeling to the story in that extent. But also tying into the Lovecraft element is the actual creatures themselves. As you pointed out, they're undersea creatures.
Yes.
They're creatures which are lifted out 20,000 leagues under the sea and put above the earth instead of in
Yes.
the seas. and you get a lot of this in Lovecraft. A lot of his kind of the tentacled monstrosities all have this sort of marine quality about them.
Mm, mm,
And all the tentacles is like the great god Cthulhu, or the alien god Cthulhu in Lovecraft is a cephalopod, and it's these tentacles coming out of his face. So there's very much that element, and then this idea of the creatures moving through rarefied atmosphere
mm,
also fits in. So in Lovecraft's 1930 story, The Whisperer in Darkness, you've got the Migo, or the fungi from Yuggoth,
mm,
who are able to move through space and through ether
mm,
by
mm,
means of membranous wings, and they can survive this sort of world. It's very much that sort of feeling going on. I was also put in mind of another of Lovecraft's earlier stories, From Beyond, in which an obsessive scientist, Crawford Tillinghast, invents a machine that emits ultraviolet rays, and suddenly you can see all these creatures which share the air with us,
mm,
and we have no idea they're there. And again, it's this kind of idea: if we only knew, we would go mad. So it's all of this is being prefigured
mm,
in the horror of the heights, and it just, I know we say this constantly, but Conan Doyle, he really is, he's ahead of the game an awful lot of the time,
mm,
and reflecting his hero Edgar Allan Poe
mm.
again in that.
And there's also that connection to Lovecraft in the fact that there's this sort of discovered journal, which is another feature of Lovecraftian literature as well.
Mm.
And I think that poses another question of this story, which is how reliable is Joyce Armstrong as a narrator? We actually have quite a good suggestion here from Timothy Tietze in the manuscript facsimile, in which he talks about Joyce Armstrong suffers from intermittent fever, which we know can lead to impaired consciousness and psychosis. But also, a sign of his apparent eccentricity is the fact that he is carrying a shotgun. Although we have a different interpretation on that once you've read the story. But also this sort of slightly distasteful, also inappropriate humour that that Joyce-Armstrong presents, the famous bit where he's asking people with an enigmatic smile, and where, pray, is Myrtle's head? But there's also that idea that this could be sort of oxygen deprivation. I mean, when he goes above the clouds, the whole language becomes less realistic. It becomes much more about traveling through the ethereal. And there's almost a suggestion that he's hallucinating. And then the final note poses a question about his sanity. It says, the picture of that monoplane skimming down the sky with the nameless terrors flying as swiftly beneath it and cutting it off always from the earth, while they gradually closed in upon their victim, is one which a man who valued his sanity would prefer not to dwell. I'm not suggesting that Joyce Armstrong is maybe suffers the same fate as William Shatner in The Twilight Zone, although he only got to half the height of Joyce Armstrong. But no, there's I just wonder if there's something else Lovecraftian there in this idea of the narrators who are either unreliable or indeed descend into madness at the end.
Oh, there's definitely that sort of quality in Lovecraft stories. They're, so many of his narrators are neurotic,
Mm,
and at odds with the world. The outsiders, they don't fit in, and again, that adds to their unreliability,
mm,
seen from within society. And these are odd characters. Can you believe a word they say? And they're teetering on the brink, many of them. And yes, there is that definite air of unreliability.
mm.
And there's also another thing they have in common with Joyce Armstrong is he knows these creatures are up there,
Yeah.
but he goes up again.
Yes, he does. Yeah.
And Lovecraft's narrators, you often reading Lovecraft, you get, don't go there.
Yes. They still do.
there's very much that kind of, you're often cringing, thinking, "Oh, they know what they're walking into." So that element is definitely there in the Horror of the Heights as well.
Mm. So we're getting close to time now on the podcast, and I really enjoyed revisiting the Horror of the Heights. For a story that was written in 1913, I think this feels remarkably modern, and there are lots of things that would be written in years to come that I think you can draw back to the Horror of the Heights as a real influence.
Yeah, I think it is. It's a fascinating story. I mean, it's an enjoyable yarn.
Yes.
First and foremost, it's great fun, but as we've discussed here, there's so much going on in the story, and it does, yeah, it does look ahead
Mm.
to the way this sort of speculative fiction is going to go. And it's also interesting from a kind of Doylean perspective, in that he takes this technology, and does a different thing to Danger, where in Danger he'd taken submarine technology, and instead of doing the Vernian exploring realms with that,
Mm.
he turns it into a war story. And with this, he takes this aviation technology, and instead of looking at the way that aircraft could be used in a military context,
Mm.
he decides, let's have fun with this, and turn it into a monster story.
Yeah. Yeah.
And it works wonderfully.
Mm. So that's it for this episode. If you would like to read the show notes, you can find them at doingsofdoyle.com. And you can also find on the website details of how to sponsor the podcast on PayPal or Patreon. So, Paul, what have we got on the podcast next time?
Next time we have a trio of odd stories, really, from Conan Doyle, which appeared in the Strand under the joint title "Strange Studies from Life," which look at a number of Victorian true crime cases in a semi-fictionalized way. And it's fascinating to look into how Doyle approached these stories and his eventual view on them.
Hmm. So, some real curios there to look forward to. So, until then, it's goodbye from me.
And goodbye from me.
Goodbye. And now you could go into the whole Freudian interpretation of giant air snakes and jellyfish.
We'd rather not.
Julia, don't look at me like that.
Bob.
I am not imagining it. I'm not imagining it. He's out there. Don't look. He's not there now. He jumps away whenever anyone might see him.